Now let me just stop and say that if you had studied the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel, you would tie them together, you would understand that there's a major player, according to the scripture, that would show up in the last days, and it's the old Roman Empire, which we commonly call today Europe, or the EU, the European Union. But here is this man who, once again, not from any kind of biblical background whatsoever, is talking about how the EU could be our pattern. Listen what he goes on to say. The EU has a Supreme Court, a currency, thousands of pages of law, a large civil service, and the ability to deploy military force. So, could the European model go global? There are 3 reasons for thinking that it might. First, it is clear that the most difficult issues facing national governments are international in nature. There is global warming, a global financial crisis, and a global war on terror. Second, it could be done. The transport and communications revolutions have shrunk the world so that, as Geoffrey Bainley, the Australian historian, has written, for the first time in human history, world government of some sort is now possible. But the third point, a change in the political atmosphere, suggests global governance. That's why, and let me just stop again, this is why we were saying last week, for those of you that were not with us, the importance to understand that our nation is going a direction that is anti-American. It's anti-capitalist. It is socialist and it's communistic. And yet, that is a part of a system that's been proven time and time again. History's repeated itself. It's what Stalin did, Mao did, Hitler did. It's the same thing. And no doubt the Antichrist will somehow be able to answer the world's dilemma by this powerful governmental stronghold. The guy goes on to say, though, the financial crisis is pushing national governments toward global solutions, even in countries such as China and the U.S. that are traditionally fierce guardians of national sovereignty. Now, the reason why I read that tonight is to let you know how the financial brains of the world are thinking. Now, you got to understand, from their standpoint, having no knowledge of the Scripture, being many of them totally ignorant to this, why would this not make sense? Now, you and I, who have come from a more biblical background, we're looking at stuff like this and we're thinking, this is exactly what the Scripture said would happen before the Antichrist would be able to ever come into place. Now, let's do a little bit more backtracking for a minute. Almost a year ago, actually it was in September the 25th of last year, the Reuters carried this headline, U.S. will lose financial superpower status. The United States will lose its superpower status in the world financial system, the article starts off. The world financial system will become more multipolar with the emergence of stronger, better capitalized centers in Asia and Europe. This was the words of a German finance minister. He's speaking before a parliament in Germany. He goes on to say, the world will never be the same again. Now keep in mind, that was not quite a year ago. This was right when things were starting to get very, very shaky for our economy. Up to this point, who would have ever thought, here we are a year later, that the government would own so much of what they own today, that the government would become so super powerful. But in the midst of all that, folks, on a world level, we've lost so much. And I want to share with you where it's going. Of course, the next month, Associated Press picked this up on October the 22nd. Headline reads this way: Bush invites world leaders to economic talks. President Bush has invited the leaders of 20 nations, known as the G20, to come to Washington on November 15th for an international meeting on the economy, the White House said Wednesday. The move could eventually lead to a far-reaching, listen to this, overhaul of the rules governing global financial markets. Now, just keep in mind, and I'm going to take you from where we're at and just keep getting closer and closer to where we are right now. Mr. Bush has been under intense pressure for several weeks from leaders in Europe. Hello. Especially President Nicolas Sarkozy of France, to assemble an international meeting of economic powers to address the financial crisis. Mr. Sarkozy has called for strengthening and rewriting the rules governing global financial institutions. And then he refers to the Bretton Woods meetings way back in 1944 when, during the Great Depression, as the results that caused, at that point, the governments of the world to join together to try to bring about that form of global financial system. Now, they're saying, let's use that as a pattern. Well, of course, that took place in November. And here is the actual photograph. You'll see at the very top there, it says Summit of Financial Markets of the World Economy. And of course, there's the G20, 19 of the largest national economies, plus the European Union. Now, right around that same time, in October, was an interesting article coming from The Economist, which is a European newsletter and magazine. And it was very interesting that the title read like this: A Light at the End of the Tunnel. And then it read, Concerted action is taken around the world to rescue the financial system. Now, I shared this with you all several months ago, but let me read this to you again. After a week in which the financial systems almost ground to a halt, governments of the industrialized world seem to have found the right tools to give credit markets moving again. He goes on to say, at the weekend, on Monday, October 13th, officials in Europe, America, and Asia announced unprecedented and comprehensive plans to prop up failing banks, guaranteeing their loans, and flood the world with cash by providing unlimited dollar funds through central banks. All of a sudden, here is this European news agency referring to the fact that the answer is going to lie in the world uniting their banks and help picking up the problem. Well, you all have heard the little phrase that the light at the end of the tunnel may be a train. And of course, the article I thought was very interesting. It was called A Light at the End of the Tunnel. But it could be that, or it could be something even worse than that. See, because if you go around that little corner, you see that light, it looks like, oh yeah, things are going to get better. You come around to the corner, and what you see may not be what you really want to see. At the end of that tunnel, technically, that light may in fact be the revealing of who the Bible calls the man of sin. Because this is going to be exactly the scenario that will one day bring a man to this place. Let me give you a little bit of insight from 2 Thessalonians. It says here in chapter 2, verse 3, Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, now listen to this statement, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself, or claiming himself to be God, showing himself that he is God. Now the obvious question is, what would bring one man to such a status? I mean, think about this for just a second. What would make the world come together and look at this man who arrogantly sits in the temple of God declaring that he is God? Well,